The library of the late Arthur Ward smelled of stale cigar smoke, beeswax, and the heavy, suffocating scent of lilies that had been brought in for the wake. It was a cold afternoon in October of 1875. Rain lashed against the window panes of the Beacon Hill townhouse, blurring the gas lamps on the street below into smeary yellow ghosts. Inside, the air was so still it felt preserved, as if the room itself were holding its breath out of respect for the dead, or perhaps out of fear of what the dead had left behind. Elise Ward sat in a high-backed leather chair that swallowed her slender frame. She wore black, a heavy bombazine fabric that rustled sharply whenever she shifted, which she tried not to do. She was 28 years old, though in the dim light, with her pale hands clasped tightly in her lap and her dark hair pulled back severely beneath her mourning veil, she felt 100. Across the mahogany desk sat Mr. Thaddeus, Arthur's solicitor. He was a man who looked as though he had been constructed entirely out of parchment and dry ink. To his right, lurking in the shadows of the bookshelves like a sleek predator waiting for a wounded animal to falter, sat Silas Morgan. Elise knew Silas. He and Arthur had been partners in various ventures, railroads mostly, and mining speculations that Arthur rarely discussed at the dinner table. Silas was a large man, broad-shouldered, with a mustache that was waxed to sharp points and eyes that were always calculating the value of everything they rested upon. Today, those eyes were resting on Elise. "Proceed, Mr. Thaddeus," Silas said, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. The solicitor cleared his throat, a dry, rattling sound. He adjusted his spectacles and peered at the document before him. "I shall dispense with the minor bequests to the household staff and proceed to the bulk of the estate." "Mr. Thaddeus said, "To my beloved wife, Elise, I leave the townhouse in Boston, the summer cottage in Newport, and the entirety of my stocks in the Atlantic Pacific line." Elise released a breath she did not realize she had been holding. It was generous. It was expected. It was the cage she had lived in for 7 years, now gilt in gold. "However, Mr. Thaddeus continued, raising a finger, "there is a codicil regarding the property known as the Silver Creek Claim and the surrounding acreage in the Nevada Territory." Elise frowned. She had never heard of Silver Creek. "The deed to said land," the solicitor read, "shall transfer to my wife, Elise, on one condition. She must travel to the territory to file the claim of ownership in person at the land office in the town of Dustfall. Furthermore, she must undertake this journey unaccompanied by family or hired escort within 6 months of my passing. Should she fail to do so, or should she decline, the title and all mineral rights shall revert immediately to my business partner, Mr. Silas Morgan." The silence that followed was absolute. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked loudly 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. "Unaccompanied," Elise whispered. The word felt foreign on her tongue. "He wants me to go to the West alone." "It was Arthur's way," Silas spoke up, leaning forward. The leather of his chair creaked. "He always believed in testing the mettle of his investments, even his personal ones." The insult was veiled, but Elise felt it land. She was an investment to Arthur, acquired from a good family, maintained at a high cost, and now, apparently, to be liquidated or tested. "It is preposterous," Elise said, her voice trembling slightly. "I have never traveled further west than Philadelphia." "Precisely," Silas said smoothly. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the rain. "Arthur knew the West is no place for a woman of your breeding. Elise, it is a land of savages, outlaws, and discomfort. The rail lines are expanding." "Yes, but they are hardly civilized." He likely added that clause assuming you would have the good sense to decline. Silas turned back to her, a sympathetic smile plastered on his face that did not reach his cold eyes. "I am prepared to save you the embarrassment. My dear, I will purchase your potential claim right now. Let us say $5,000. It is a generous sum for a patch of dust and cactus." Elise looked at him. $5,000 was a significant amount, but Arthur had been a wealthy man. If Silas Morgan was offering $5,000 before she even knew what the land was worth, it meant the land was likely worth $50,000 or $500,000. But it was not the money that made her hesitate. It was the control, even from the grave. Arthur was moving her like a pawn on a chessboard. If she stayed, she did what he expected. She remained the decorative, obedient wife who was too fragile for the real world. If she went, she was jumping through his hoop. I need time to consider, Elise said. Silas's smile tightened at the corners. Of course, but do not take too long. The clock is ticking, and the winter snows in the Rockies can delay trains for weeks. 6 months goes by faster than you think. The reception following the reading was a suffocating affair. The parlor was filled with women in black silk and men in somber gray suits, balancing teacups and murmuring platitudes. Elise felt like a ghost haunting her own life. She moved from group to group, catching snippets of conversation that died away the moment she approached. "Did you hear?" a voice whispered from behind a potted fern. It was Mrs. Gable, a woman whose primary source of nourishment was the misfortune of others. Arthur left her a mine or some such nonsense out in the territories. "She will never go," another woman replied with a dismissive sniff. "The West Y, my cousin's husband, went out there last year. Said the trains derail constantly, and the Indians, they say the Sioux and the Apache are on the warpath. A woman alone. She would be dead before she reached the Mississippi River. Or worse, Mrs. Gable added darkly. Kidnapped, ruined. It is a lawless place. No morals. Just dirt and men who have forgotten how to be gentlemen." Elise stood by the heavy velvet drapes, her hand gripping the fabric until her knuckles turned white. Ruined. Dead. Lawless. The words should have terrified her. And they did. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. But beneath the fear, there was something else. The heat. A friction. She looked around the room. The crystal chandelier. The imported rugs. The portraits of Arthur's ancestors staring down with disapproval. This was safe. This was civilization. And it was a tomb. She had spent 7 years being corrected by Arthur. Her laugh was too loud, her opinions too sharp, her desire to read philosophy unladylike. She had shrunk herself to fit into this room, into this life. If she stayed, she would simply become Mrs. Gable in 20 years, a bitter old woman in black, sipping tea and judging the world she was too afraid to enter. Silas Morgan was standing by the fireplace, holding a glass of sherry. He caught her eye and raised his glass in a mock toast, confident in his victory. He thought she was weak. Arthur thought she was weak. Elise turned away from him and walked out of the parlor. She climbed the stairs to the master bedroom. It was cold. She walked to the vanity mirror and looked at herself. The reflection showed a pale woman with frightened eyes. "No," she said aloud to the empty room. The word sounded small, but firm. She began to unpin her hair. It tumbled down her back, heavy and dark. She stripped off the veil and threw it onto the floor. "I am not a ghost," she whispered, "and I am not a pawn." The next morning, Elise Ward went to the bank. She withdrew $2,000 in cash and drafts. Then, she went to the Central Station ticket office. The Boston rail station was a cavern of noise and steam, a mechanical belly digesting thousands of people. It smelled of coal smoke, unwashed bodies, and roasted peanuts. Elise stood in the line, her heart racing so fast she felt dizzy. She was wearing a traveling suit of dark blue wool, practical, durable, and less conspicuous than her morning weeds. "Destination?" the ticket agent asked, not looking up from his ledger. "Dustfall," Elise said. "In the Nevada territory." The agent paused. He looked up, his eyes scanning her face, her gloved hands, the lack of a male companion. One way," Elise said. When she stepped onto the platform, the reality of her decision hit her like a physical blow. The train was a monster of iron and steel, hissing steam that curled around her ankles. But it was the people that shocked her most. In Boston, the classes were separated by neighborhoods and walls. Here, They were shoved together on the platform. There were rough men with calloused hands carrying pickaxes wrapped in canvas. There were families speaking Italian and German, carrying everything they owned in bundles on their backs. There were soldiers in blue uniforms, looking tired and grim. A group of men were being escorted in chains by marshals, prisoners being transported. Further down, she saw a Native American man, his hair long and braided, standing stooped and silent as people gave him a wide berth. He was not in chains, but he looked trapped all the same. Elise clutched her carpet bag tighter. This was the world Mrs. Gable had warned her about. It was dirty. It was loud. It was potentially dangerous. She found her carriage. It was a Pullman car, comfortable enough, but certainly not the private luxury Arthur would have insisted upon. She found her seat by the window and sat down, arranging her skirts. The whistle blew. A long, mournful shriek that echoed off the station roof. The train jerked forward. Metal ground against metal. Elise looked out the window. The platform began to slide away. She saw a reflection of herself in the glass, superimposed over the passing pillars of the station. The smoke from the engine swirled outside, graying out the city she had called home for her entire life. As the train gathered speed, leaving the cobblestones and the church spires behind, the reflection in the glass seemed to change. The fear was still there in her eyes. Yes, but the chin was raised higher. The mouth was set in a line of determination. She was alone. She was terrified. But for the first time in her life, the direction she was traveling was of her own choosing. "Goodbye, Arthur," she whispered to the rhythm of the wheels. Clack, 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 clack. 3 days later and 1,000 miles away. The atmosphere was entirely different at the Union Station in Chicago. It was chaos. Jonah Hale stood in the center of the telegraph office, his presence dominating the room despite the swirl of activity around him. He was 32 years old, tall, with hair the color of dark sand and eyes that were currently flashing with irritation. He wore a suit that cost more than most men earned in 5 years, cut to fit broad shoulders that had once swung a sledgehammer for a living. He slammed a piece of paper down on the counter. "What do you mean? Delayed?" Jonah demanded. His voice was not the polished baritone of an Eastern aristocrat. It had the rough edge of gravel and iron, the voice of a man who built things. The station master, a flustered man with ink-stained fingers, stammered, "I am sorry. Mr. Hale, the telegram just came through. The bridge over the muddy river is out, the Silver Streak Express. The luxury line is held up in Cleveland. It will not be here for another 24 hours. Jonah swore under his breath. He checked his pocket watch. Gold, heavy, engraved. "I do not have 24 hours. I have a meeting with the investors in San Francisco on the 15th. If I am not there to sign the merger, the deal falls through." He ran a hand through his hair, messing up the careful grooming. He had spent 10 years clawing his way up from a track layer to a shareholder. He owned silver mines, timber rights, and a significant portion of the rail line itself, but the East Coast bankers still looked at him and saw a laborer in a fancy suit. If he missed this meeting, they would eat him alive. "Is there another train?" Jonah asked, his jaw tight. "Well," the station master hesitated. "There is the Overland number 4. It is leaving in 20 minutes. But, Mr. Hale, you would not want that train. It is a mixed line, freight and passenger. It stops at every water tower and cattle town between here and the coast. It is slow, dirty, and, frankly, beneath a man at your station." Jonah looked at the station master, then at the clock on the wall. He thought about the comfortable private car waiting for him in Cleveland, with its velvet seats and brandy snifters. Then he thought about the look on Silas Morgan's face if Jonah failed to secure the financing for the new spur line. Silas was a partner. Yes, but he was a shark, and Jonah knew better than to bleed in the water. "Does it have an engine?" Jonah asked. "Yes, sir, but..." "Does it have wheels?" "Yes, sir." "Then put me on it." Jonah snapped. He grabbed his own valise, ignoring the porter who rushed forward to help. "I do not care if I have to sit on a crate of chickens. Get me on that train." He turned and strode out onto the platform. the tails of his coat flapping behind him. He was a man used to bending the world to his will, used to buying his way out of inconvenience. He did not know, as he marched toward the soot-stained, grumbling engine of the Overland No. 4, that he was walking away from his carefully calculated schedule and straight into a collision course with a destiny he could not buy, sell, or control. He was getting on the wrong train, at the wrong time, for all the right reasons, though he would not realize it until he looked into the eyes of a widow holding a deed that could ruin them both. The interior of the Overland No. 4 was a sensory assault that Jonah Hale was ill-equipped to handle. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed wool, stale tobacco smoke, and the omnipresent grit of coal dust that seemed to seep through the very pores of the wood. It was a far cry from the velvet-cushioned private car he had paid for, the one currently sitting idly on a sidetrack in Cleveland, while he rattled westward in a wooden box filled with prospectors, farmers, and families desperate enough to stake their lives on a rumor of gold or fertile soil. Jonah stood near the end of the car, one hand gripping a brass rail to steady himself against the violent swaying of the carriage. He had surrendered his seat an hour ago to a woman holding a colicky infant, a gesture that was born less out of altruism and more out of a desire to avoid having the child vomit on his Italian leather boots. He checked his pocket watch again. They were 3 hours behind schedule. Every minute lost was a dollar hemorrhage in the San Francisco deal. He snapped the gold case shut with a sharp click that was lost in the cacophony of the train. Further down the aisle, a woman in a dark traveling suit was attempting to hoist a heavy leather valise into the overhead rack. Jonah watched her with a critical eye. She was too slender for the task, her movements hampered by the restrictive cut of her morning attire. She was out of place here, a delicate orchid tossed into a bin of turnips. Just as she managed to lift the bag to shoulder height, the train lurched violently over a rough section of track. The sudden motion threw her off balance. She stumbled backward, the heavy bag slipping from her gloved fingers. Jonah moved without thinking. It was a reflex honed from years on the rail lines, where a slow reaction meant a crushed limb. He lunged forward, catching the woman's waist with one arm and deflecting the falling valise with the other. The bag hit the floor with a heavy thud, but the woman did not fall. She collided with him hard. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed down to the point of impact. Elise's back was pressed firmly against Jonah's chest. His arm was wrapped securely around her midsection. His hands splayed over the dark wool of her jacket. She could feel the heat of him radiating through the layers of clothing. A solid, unyielding presence that was shockingly intimate. Jonah looked down. He could smell her scent over the coal smoke, something floral and clean, like lavender water and rain. Her hat had been knocked askew, revealing a flash of pale neck and dark hair. He felt the rapid hammer of her heart against his forearm. It was a sensation that sent a jolt of electricity straight down his spine, startling him with its intensity. Elise gasped, her hands instinctively clutching at the arm that held her. She looked up, twisting slightly, and her eyes met his. They were wide, brown, and filled with a mixture of shock and humiliation. For 3 seconds, neither of them moved. The train rattled on, oblivious. The contact was improper, scandalous even, yet neither pulled away immediately. There was a magnetic tension in the air, a silent acknowledgement of the physical reality of two bodies pressed together in a confined space. Then, the train steadied, and the spell broke. Elise scrambled away from him, smoothing her skirts with trembling hands. Her face flushed a deep crimson. I beg your pardon," she stammered, her voice breathless. Jonah straightened his own coat, his expression hardening into a mask of aloof irritation to cover the sudden unsteadiness of his own pulse. "You should not attempt to lift heavy cargo while the train is in motion, madam," he said, his voice cool and clipped. "It is a simple law of physics." Elise bristled at his tone. The embarrassment was quickly replaced by a flash of annoyance. She recognized his type, the wealthy Easterner who viewed the world as a series of inconveniences to be managed. "If the engineer drove with any degree of competence, sir, the laws of physics would not be quite so aggressive." Jonah raised an eyebrow. "The engineer is doing his best with a boiler that belongs in a museum," he retorted, kicking her valise slightly out of the aisle with the toe of his boot. "Much like this entire rolling disaster, this is hardly the conveyance I paid for." "And yet," Elise said, lifting her chin and adjusting her hat, "you are here with the rest of us. I suppose your money does not weigh enough to hold the train steady." Jonah opened his mouth to reply, to deliver a cutting remark about how much his money actually weighed, but the retort died in his throat. A sharp crack echoed from outside, louder than the rhythmic clacking of the wheels. Then another. Glass shattered at the front of the car. "Get down!" Jonah roared. He did not wait for her to process the command. He grabbed Elise by the shoulders and shoved her forcefully into the gap between two bench seats. He dove after her, covering her body with his own just as a hail of bullets tore through the wooden walls of the carriage. Screams erupted throughout the car. The train's whistle shrieked, a long, terrified wail, and the brakes screeched, locking the wheels and sending sparks flying as the massive iron beast skidded to a halt. "What is happening?" Elise cried, her face pressed against the dusty floorboards. "Road agents," Jonah growled. He reached inside his coat. He was not wearing a gun belt. It was uncivilized for a boardroom, but he carried a compact Colt revolver in a shoulder holster. He drew it, checking the cylinder with practiced ease. The train came to a shuddering stop. Outside, the sound of galloping hooves and rough shouting filled the air. "Stay here," Jonah commanded. "Do not move your head. My bag," Elise whispered, her eyes darting to the valise lying in the aisle. "I need my bag." "Forget the bag," Jonah snapped. "They want the payroll in the express car. They will not bother with your unmentionables." But he was wrong. The doors at the end of the car were kicked open. 3 men stormed in, their faces obscured by bandanas, long dusters flapping around their legs. They did not move like desperate drifters. They moved with military precision. "Everyone stay down," the leader shouted. He scanned the cowering passengers, his eyes searching. "We are looking for a woman, dark hair, traveling alone." Elise's blood ran cold. They were not looking for a payroll. They were looking for her. Silas Morgan had not waited for the 6 months to expire. Jonah heard the specific instruction and stiffened. He looked at Elise beneath him, realizing in an instant that she was not merely a clumsy widow. She was a target. One of the bandits began moving down the aisle, kicking luggage aside. "Check the tags," the leader barked. The bandit reached the spot where Elise's valise lay. He bent down, reading the leather tag. "Elise Ward," he announced. "Got it. Grab it and find her," the leader yelled. Elise lunged. It was an act of sheer, reckless desperation. That bag contained the deed, the will, the only proof that she existed as a legal entity in this territory. "No!" she screamed, scrambling out from under Jonah. "Elise, stop!" Jonah shouted, grabbing for her ankle, but she was too fast. She threw herself at the man holding her bag, clawing at his arm. "That is mine. Give it back." The bandit, surprised by the ferocity of the attack, stumbled back. He raised his heavy-gloved hand and backhanded her across the face. The force of the blow sent Elise crashing into the wooden seat frame. She crumpled to the floor, dazed, blood trickling from a cut on her lip. The sight of the violence flipped a switch in Jonah Hale. The businessman vanished. The man who had fought his way out of the Pennsylvania coal pits with his bare knuckles returned. He rose from his crouch and fired. His bullet caught the bandit in the shoulder, spinning him around. The man dropped the bag, but another bandit immediately scooped it up. "We have the papers. Let us go," the second man shouted. The leader turned his Winchester rifle toward Jonah. Jonah dove behind a seat just as the wood splintered under the impact of the slug. He returned fire, but he was outgunned. Suddenly, a different sound cut through the chaos. It was a high-pitched, trilling cry, followed by the thundering of hooves that sounded like a rock slide. From the ridge overlooking the stalled train, a line of silhouettes appeared against the harsh midday sun. They were mounted warriors, painted for war. A volley of arrows and rifle fire rained down, not on the train, but on the bandits outside. The shots were precise, kicking up dirt inches from the outlaws' horses. "Apache," one of the bandits screamed. "Chayton's riders!" The bandits panicked. They knew the reputation of the warrior named Chayton. He did not take prisoners. The leader fired one last wild shot toward the train, then whistled. "Ride! We have what we came for, ride!" Clutching Elise's bag. The bandits mounted their horses and spurred them away, scattering into the ravine just as the indigenous warriors crested the hill. Inside the car, silence fell, heavy and suffocating. Jonah holstered his hot weapon and crawled over to Elise. She was sitting up, her hand cupping her bleeding lip, her eyes fixed on the retreating dust cloud. She looked utterly destroyed. "Are you hurt badly?" Jonah asked, his voice softer now. He reached out to touch her shoulder, but she flinched away. "They took it," she whispered. "They took everything." The train could not move. The bandits had blown a section of the track ahead to force the stop, and the boiler had taken a stray bullet, leaking steam like a dying dragon. The passengers were forced to disembark at a small, unnamed watering station a mile down the line. It was a desolate place, a water tower, a telegraph shack, and a wooden platform baking under the relentless sun. The wind blew grit into their eyes. Elise sat on a crate, her posture rigid. The shock had worn off, replaced by a cold, hard fury. Jonah approached her, holding a canteen of water. He looked impeccable despite the dust, his jaw set in a line of frustration. "Here," he said, offering the water. "Drink." Elise ignored the canteen. She looked up at him, her eyes blazing. "You let them take it." Jonah blinked, taken aback. "I beg your pardon, I saved your life. Madam, if I had not pulled you down, you would have a hole in your chest." "I did not ask you to save me," Elise snapped, her voice rising. "I needed those papers. Without them, I am nothing. I am just a stranded widow with no money and no name." "It is just paper," Jonah said dismissively, though a knot of unease was tightening in his stomach. He had seen the brand on the bandits' horses. It was a circle with a line through it, the brand of the Morgan Mining Consortium. Silas. Paper can be replaced. Lives cannot. "Not these papers," Elise said bitterly. "That was the deed to the Silver Creek claim. And my husband's will?" Jonah froze. The Silver Creek claim. The knot in his stomach turned into a lead weight. He knew that claim. He had reviewed the geological surveys for it 3 months ago. It was the key to the new rail spur, and Silas Morgan was his partner in that venture. "Listen," Jonah said, reaching for his wallet. "I am a man of considerable means. I can compensate you for your loss. Whatever the land was worth. I will write you a draft right now. $5,000, $10,000. Elise stood up. She was shorter than him, but in that moment, she seemed to tower over him. "You think you can buy everything," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "You think money fixes every broken thing? That land was my freedom. It was my only chance to be free of men like you who think they own the world. I am trying to help you," Jonah argued, his own temper fraying. "You are stranded in the middle of nowhere." "I would rather walk to the Pacific Ocean than take a penny from you," Elise declared. Before Jonah could retort, the sound of a single horse approaching silenced them both. The passengers huddled together, fearful of another attack, but there was only one rider. He rode a paint horse without a saddle, guiding it with his knees. He wore buckskin leggings and a linen shirt that had seen better days. His hair was black as a raven's wing, hanging loose around a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. It was the warrior from the ridge, Chayton. He stopped the horse 10 feet from the platform. He did not look at the terrified passengers. His dark, impenetrable eyes locked onto Jonah. "You," Chayton said. His voice was low, the English heavily accented but clear. "Iron Horse Man." Jonah stepped forward, placing himself instinctively between Elise and the rider. "I have no quarrel with you." Jonah said, "Thank you for driving off the thieves." Chayton looked at Jonah with open contempt. "I did not do it for you. They are jackals. They eat the land. You," he gestured to the stalled train, "you are the plague that brings the jackals." Jonah stiffened. "We are just travelers." Chayton's gaze shifted to Elise. He looked at her bruised lip, then at her empty hands. "The jackals took your burden," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," Elise said, stepping out from behind Jonah. "They took my papers, for the land in the valley." Chayton's expression did not change, but the air around him seemed to grow colder. "The Valley of the Ancestors," he said, "the place you call Silver Creek." "You know it?" Elise asked, a spark of hope lighting her eyes. "I know it," Chayton said. "It is where my people sleep. It is where the earth breathes." He leaned forward on his horse. "The man you call Silas Morgan wants to cut the throat of the valley with his iron rails. He sent his dogs to steal your claim, so he can kill the land legally." Jonah felt the blood drain from his face. Silas. It was confirmed, and Jonah was the one who had engineered the financing for those rails. He was, inadvertently, the architect of this woman's ruin. "You must go back," Chayton said to Elise. "Go back to your stone cities. This land will chew you up." "I cannot go back," Elise said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I have nowhere else to go. I have to get those papers back. I have to go to the valley." Chayton studied her for a long moment. He saw the fear in her, but he also saw the fire. He looked at Jonah, seeing the guilt that the wealthy man was trying to hide. "Then you will die," Chayton said simply. "Silas Morgan has many dogs, and the valley is hungry." He turned his horse. "Wait," Jonah called out. "Where did they go, the bandits?" Chayton looked back over his shoulder. "They ride to Dustfall, to the master." With a kick of his heels, Chayton galloped away, disappearing into the shimmering heat haze. Elise watched him go, then turned to look at the endless, empty horizon. The reality of her situation settled over her. She had no money. She had no proof of ownership. She had a powerful enemy waiting for her. She turned to look at Jonah. He was staring at the ground, his hand clenching and unclenching. "You know him," Elise said softly. It was a statement, not a question. "You know Silas Morgan." Jonah looked up. He could have lied. He could have walked away. But he looked at the bruise on her face, a bruise caused by his partner's ambition. "Yes," Jonah said, his voice rough. "I know him, and if he has your papers, he is going to Dustfall." "Then that is where I am going," Elise said. "You will never make it alone." Jonah said, "It is 50 miles of desert." "Then I will walk," Elise said. She adjusted her torn jacket, lifted her chin, and took the first step off the platform onto the dusty earth. Jonah watched her. He thought of his meeting in San Francisco. He thought of the millions of dollars at stake. Then he looked at the determined back of the widow walking into a wasteland she did not understand. He cursed softly, a long, inventive string of profanity. Then he jumped off the platform and jogged to catch up with her. "You are going the wrong way," Jonah said, matching her stride. "Dustfall is north, and you are going to need water." Elise didn't look at him, but she didn't send him away. They walked side by side. The Tycoon and the widow, two mismatched figures shrinking against the vast, indifferent canvas of the West, bound together by a stolen deed and a train that had never arrived. Dustfall was not so much a town as it was a desperate argument between civilization and the indifferent desert. And looking at the state of the main street, it appeared the desert was winning. The buildings were hasty constructions of raw lumber and adobe, bleached bone white by the relentless sun. There was a church with a crooked steeple, a bank with barred windows, and a row of saloons that outnumbered the businesses of virtue 3-1. Elise Ward and Jonah Hale arrived in Dustfall late in the afternoon, hitching a ride on the back of a mule-drawn buckboard wagon driven by a taciturn prospector who had taken pity on them 5 miles out of town. They looked like refugees from a disaster, which, in a sense, they were. Elise's fine wool traveling suit was coated in a thick layer of gray dust, the hem torn where it had caught on a mesquite bush. Her face was pale, save for the darkening bruise on her cheekbone and the sunburn across her nose. Jonah fared little better. His expensive suit was ruined, his silk tie gone, and his boots scuffed beyond recognition. As they climbed down from the wagon in front of the general store, the town seemed to pause. The rhythmic hammering from the blacksmith shop ceased. Conversations on the boardwalks died away. Elise felt the weight of 100 eyes pressing against her. In Boston, a stare was a polite social correction. Here, it felt predatory. Men leaning against the saloon posts chewed tobacco and looked her up and down with an openness that made her skin crawl. They did not see a grieving widow. They saw a curiosity, a misplaced ornament that had fallen off the shelf and cracked. "Keep walking," Jonah murmured, his hand hovering near the small of her back without actually touching her. "Do not look at them." They passed a group of women standing outside the millinery shop. These women wore calico and gingham, their faces weathered and hard. They whispered behind their hands as Elise passed. "Look at her," one woman hissed, loud enough to be heard. "Another fancy Easterner thinking she can tame the dirt. She will be gone in a week," another replied with a cruel chuckle. "Or she will be working at the Golden Garter. That is where women without husbands usually end up around here." Elise stiffened, her spine straightening instinctively. The judgment burned worse than the sun. To these women, she was either a fool to be pitied or a loose woman to be scorned. There was no middle ground for a female traveling alone in the territories. It was a silent crime against the social order of the frontier. "Ignore them," Jonah said, though his own jaw was set tight. He was acutely aware of the stares directed at him as well, the hostility reserved for men who wore suits instead of work shirts. They needed shelter. The only hotel in town, the Drover's Rest, looked like a place where one might contract cholera simply by touching the door handle. "There," Jonah said, pointing to a 2-story building at the end of the street. The sign swung in the dry wind. The Hearth Barrel. It looked sturdier than the rest. Clean curtains visible in the upper windows. They pushed through the swinging doors. The interior was dim and smelled of sawdust, stale beer, and roast beef. A long bar ran down one side, and tables were scattered across the floor. Behind the bar stood a woman who looked like she could command a cavalry regiment. She was tall, with hair the color of iron filings piled high on her head. She wiped a glass with a rag that looked cleaner than Jonah's shirt. This was Nora. Nora watched them approach, her eyes sharp and assessing. She took in Elise's quality clothes beneath the filth, the bruise, and then looked at Jonah's posture arrogant, moneyed, impatient. "We need rooms," Jonah said, leaning against the bar. "2 of them. And hot water. A lot of it." Nora set the glass down. "We do not cater to transient drifters," she said, her voice raspy like dry leaves. "But you 2 do not look like drifters. You look like a bad accident." "We were on the overland," Elise said, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "It was robbed. We walked." The room went quiet. The men playing cards in the corner paused. Robberies were common, but walking away from them was less so. Nora's expression softened, but only by a fraction. "You are the widow," she said. It was a statement. Word travels faster than the telegraph wire out here. "Elise Ward." Elise blinked. "How do you know my name?" "Honey, this is Silas Morgan's town," Nora said, leaning over the bar. "When Silas sneezes, the windows rattle in dustfall." "He has been asking about a widow coming in on the train. Seems you are late." Elise felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Nora shifted her gaze to Jonah. Her eyes narrowed. "And you, I know your face. You are the money man from Chicago. Hail. You own shares in every foot of rail that crosses the territory." Jonah did not flinch. "I am just a traveler today, madam." "Likely story," Nora scoffed. She reached under the counter and slapped a heavy iron key on the wood. "Room 2 and room 3, upstairs. $2 a night, each, and I do not want any trouble from Silas's boys in my place. If they come for you, you take it outside." "Thank you," Elise said, taking the key. "Do not thank me yet," Nora muttered as she turned to pour a drink for a customer. "You are a lamb in a wolf den. Little lady, and your friend there." She jerked her head toward Jonah. "He smells like a wolf too, even if he has lost his teeth." An hour later, washed but still wearing her battered clothes, Elise walked to the sheriff's office. Jonah had gone to the telegraph office, or so he said. Elise needed to do this alone. She needed to believe there was still law in this land. Sheriff Cole was a man who looked like he had been left out in the rain too long. His vest was tight around his middle, and his badge was pinned crookedly to his shirt. He sat with his feet up on a scarred desk, whittling a piece of pine. When Elise entered, he scrambled to his feet, dropping the wood shaving. "Ma'am," he mumbled, adjusting his belt. "Can I help you?" "I want to report a robbery," Elise said, standing tall in the center of the office. "The overland train was stopped 10 miles east. Armed men. They took my property. Specifically, a leather valise containing legal documents." Cole rubbed the back of his neck, looking everywhere but at her eyes. "Yeah, I heard the wire. Terrible business. Road agents are a plague." "They were not just road agents," Elise said firmly. "They asked for me by name. They were looking for those papers. It was targeted. Sheriff—" Cole winced. He walked over to the window and looked out at the street. "Now, ma'am, that is a serious accusation. Targeted." "They work for Silas Morgan," Elise said. Cole stiffened. The air in the room seemed to get heavier. He turned back to her, his face pleading. "Mrs. Ward, you cannot go throwing names like that around. Mr. Morgan is a respected businessman. He built half this town. He hired men to steal the deed to my husband's land," Elise insisted. "I need you to arrest them. I need you to retrieve my property." Cole sighed, a long, defeated sound. "I will write up a report. Ma'am, I will ride out and look at the tracks. But the desert is big, and if those boys are gone, they are gone. You have no proof it was Morgan." "I have my eyes," Elise said, her voice rising in frustration. "And I have the witness of the other passengers." "Strangers," Cole said dismissively. "Look, Mrs. Ward, take some advice. Go back east. Whatever is in that bag, it is not worth dying for. The law out here, it bends. It has to, or it breaks. Mr. Morgan, he is the wind. You do not arrest the wind." Elise looked at the star on his chest. It was tin, cheap and dull. "Then what is the point of you, Sheriff?" she asked softly. Cole did not answer. He just looked at his boots, while Elise was failing to find justice. Jonah Hale was finding the source of the corruption. He walked straight to the Morgan Mining Rail Company office, a brick building that looked out of place among the wooden shacks. It had glass windows, a mahogany door, and the smell of money. He pushed past the clerk in the front room and threw open the double doors to the inner sanctum. Silas Morgan sat behind a desk that was larger than a dining table. He was smoking a cigar, the smoke curling up to the stamped tin ceiling. He did not look surprised to see Jonah. "Jonah," Silas boomed, standing up and spreading his arms. "I heard you were on the number 4. Terrible luck. I trust you are unhurt." Jonah kicked the door shut behind him. He walked up to the desk and placed his hands flat on the polished surface, leaning in until he was inches from Silas's face. "Cut the pleasantries. Silas," Jonah said, his voice low and dangerous. "Your dogs hit my train." Silas chuckled, tapping ash into a crystal tray. "My dogs? I have no idea what you were talking about. It was bandits. Jonah, the territory is wild." "They knew her name," Jonah said. "They took her papers. Do not insult my intelligence. You promised me this route was clean. You said the land acquisition was handled." "It is handled," Silas said, his smile fading. His eyes went cold and hard like flint. "Or it will be, once the 6 months are up, which is soon. I am just ensuring the inevitable." "You almost got me killed," Jonah said. "Collateral damage." Silas shrugged. "I did not know you were on that train. But now that you are here, let us be practical. You are a businessman. Jonah, you look at the bottom line. That valley, it is sitting on a vein of silver 10 feet wide, and it is the only flat grade through the mountains for 50 miles. If we build the rail there, the stock triples. Jonah straightened up. He thought of the numbers. 3 times his investment. It would make him one of the richest men in Chicago. It would secure his legacy. And the widow? Jonah asked. She is an obstacle, Silas said dismissively. A relic of Arthur's sentimental weakness. She does not belong here. If she goes home, she lives a long, happy life with the money I will pay her for the land. If she stays... Silas let the sentence hang in the air. He opened a drawer and pulled out a box of cigars, offering one to Jonah. Do not let a pretty face cloud your judgment. Son, you stick with me. You get the silver. You get the power. You side with her. You get dust, and maybe a bullet intended for someone else. Jonah looked at the cigar. He looked at Silas, a man who represented everything Jonah had worked to become powerful, untouchable, ruthless. I want my share protected, Jonah said quietly. It is protected, Silas promised. Just stay out of the way. Let the clock run out. Jonah turned and walked out of the office. He felt sick. He felt dirty, but he did not say no. That evening, the heat of the day broke, leaving behind a purple twilight that bruised the sky. Elise could not stand the confines of her room at the inn. She walked to the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to sagebrush and vast emptiness. She wrapped her shawl tight around her shoulders. She felt utterly alone. The sheriff was useless. Jonah was complicated, and Silas was winning. The wind carries secrets, a voice said from the shadows. Elise gasped and spun around. Chayton stepped out from behind a cluster of rocks. He was not on his horse this time. He stood on the ground, silent as a ghost. He wore a leather vest and a necklace of bone beads. You, Elise breathed. You followed us. I watched you, Chayton corrected, to see if you would run. I am not running, Elise said, though her voice trembled. Chayton moved closer. He did not smell of the town of beer and coal. He smelled of sage and wood smoke. You seek the paper, he said, to own the land. It is my inheritance, Elise said defensively. My husband left it to me. Your husband? Chayton spat the word. He bought lines on a map. He did not know the land, that valley. You call it Silver Creek. We call it the Sleeping Giant's Breath. It is where my father is buried. It is where the bones of 1,000 years rest. Elise fell silent. She had thought of the land as an asset, or as a symbol of her freedom. She had not thought of it as a church. Silas Morgan wants to blast the rocks, Chayton continued, his voice vibrating with suppressed anger. He wants to dig up the bones to lay his iron tracks. If you give him the land, you kill my people's spirit. If you keep the land, do you have the strength to hold it? I do not know, Elise whispered. I am just one woman. One woman can start a fire, Chayton said, or she can let the fire burn her. If you give it to Silas, blood will spill. My warriors will not let the tracks pass over the graves. We will fight, and the army will come, and many will die. He looked at her, his dark eyes piercing her soul. Is your inheritance worth a war? Elise Ward. Elise looked out at the darkening horizon. She saw the faces of the bandits. She saw the fear in Sheriff Cole's eyes. She saw the arrogance of Silas, and she felt the ghost of Arthur, laughing at her weakness. No, Elise said, finding a steel core within herself she did not know existed. It is not worth a war, but it is worth fighting him. Chayton nodded slowly. It was not a gesture of friendship, but of respect. Then do not fight alone. He vanished back into the shadows as quickly as he had appeared, leaving Elise standing alone under the first emerging stars. Elise found Jonah sitting on the porch of the hearth barrel. He was nursing a glass of whiskey, staring at the street. He had found a fresh shirt somewhere, but he still looked ragged around the edges. She walked up the steps and stood in front of him. Did you see him? She asked. Jonah looked up. Silas. Yes, I saw him. And he denied everything, Jonah said, taking a sip of the amber liquid. He offered me a cigar. He told me to be a smart businessman. And are you? Elise asked. A smart businessman. Jonah swirled the whiskey in the glass. I have spent 10 years trying to be. It is the only thing that keeps you warm at night. Elise, success. Nora told me you have shares in the railroad, Elise said. She said you profit if the tracks get built. Jonah paused. He did not look at her. That is true. If the line goes through Silver Creek, I stand to make a great deal of money. Elise felt a sharp pang of betrayal, though she had expected it. So that is it. You are on his side? Jonah set the glass down on the railing with a sharp clack. He stood up. He was close to her now, looming tall in the darkness. If I were on his side, I would be in his office drinking his brandy, not sitting on this porch with a woman who has nothing but a stolen bag and a stubborn streak a mile wide. He looked angry. Angry at Silas, angry at the situation, but mostly angry at himself. I cannot do this alone. Jonah, Elise said, her voice softening. I need those papers. I know where they are. The bandits, they would not have destroyed them. They need them for legal transfer after the deadline. Silas has them. He likely keeps them in a safe in his office, Jonah said. Or at the bank. Both are guarded. You can get close to him, Elise said. He trusts you, or he thinks he owns you. Jonah looked at her. You want me to steal from my own partner? I want you to choose, Elise said. She stepped closer, her eyes searching for him. Chayton came to see me. He told me about the land. It is a burial ground. Jonah, if Silas gets it, he destroys it. He starts a war with the tribe. Is that the cost of your profit, blood and bones? Jonah closed his eyes. He saw the bandits on the train. He saw the way he had held Elise when the world was shaking. He felt the pull of the East, the safety, the money. And he felt the pull of the West, the raw, honest danger of it. If I help you, Jonah said, opening his eyes, Silas will ruin me. He will cut me out of the consortium. I will lose my standing in Chicago. If you help me, Elise said, I will split the claim with you. We develop the land around the valley. We built a station. We find a way to route the tracks that does not desecrate the graves. We make money. Jonah, but we do it with clean hands. It was a naive offer. Business did not work that way. But looking at Elise, her hair wind-blown, her eyes fierce, her spirit unbroken by the desert or the men who tried to crush her, Jonah found he did not care about how business worked. He extended his hand. It was a large hand, calloused from his past, manicured for his present. 50% of the station rights, Jonah negotiated, his voice gruff to hide his emotion. And I control the engineering of the alternate route. Elise looked at his hand. She reached out and took it. Her grip was surprisingly strong. Deal, she said, as their hands clasped. A sound echoed through the night air. It was the whistle of a train, far off in the distance, echoing off the canyon walls. It was a lonely, mournful sound, like a beast crying out in the dark. It was heading west, toward the valley, a reminder that the machine of progress never stopped, and they were standing directly in its path. We have to move fast, Jonah said, not letting go of her hand. The clock is ticking. The sun over the Nevada territory did not shine. It struck. It was a physical weight, pressing down on the shoulders of Elise Ward as she guided her horse through a labyrinth of sandstone and sagebrush. They had left Dustfall at dawn, a strange triumvirate riding into the wasteland, the warrior, the Tycoon, and the widow. Chayton rode ahead, his spine as straight as a lodgepole, guiding them not by maps but by the subtle language of the land, a bent twig, a disturbed patch of gravel, the flight path of a hawk. Jonah Hale rode beside Elise. He had traded his ruined suit jacket for a canvas duster and a wide-brimmed hat he had purchased at the general store. He looked less like a Chicago financier and more like the man he must have been 10 years ago, rough-hewn and capable. For hours, the only sounds were the crunch of hooves on dry land and the relentless sigh of the wind. Elise was exhausted. Her thighs burned from the saddle, and the dust coated her throat like powdered glass. Yet, she did not complain. Every time Jonah cast a worried glance in her direction, she straightened her back and fixed her eyes on the horizon. She was done being fragile. The sky is turning, Chayton said, pulling his paint horse to a halt. He pointed to the west. Elise looked. The horizon was no longer blue. A wall of copper-colored darkness was rising from the earth. swallowing the mountains. It roiled and churned like a living thing. "Sandstorm!" Jonah shouted over the rising wind. "We need cover." "There!" Chayton commanded, pointing toward a cluster of jagged rock formations that rose from the desert floor like the teeth of a buried giant. "The canyon cut! Move!" They kicked their horses into a gallop. The wind hit them seconds later, screaming like a banshee. It carried sand that stung the skin like needles. The world dissolved into a chaotic haze of orange and brown. Elise felt her horse panic, sidestepping dangerously. But a strong hand grabbed her bridle. It was Jonah. "Hold on!" he roared. They reached the rocks just as visibility dropped to zero. Chayton found a deep fissure in the canyon wall, a narrow cave barely large enough for 3 people, though the horses had to be hobbled and covered with blankets in the lee of the stone. Jonah pulled Elise from her saddle and practically threw her into the crevice. He scrambled in after her, followed by Chayton. The space was cramped. To fit, they had to press back against the cool stone. The storm raged outside, a deafening roar that drowned out all thought. The wind whipped around the entrance, sending swirls of sand into their refuge. "Get back," Jonah ordered. He positioned himself at the mouth of the fissure, using his broad back as a shield to protect Elise from the worst of the grit. Elise was pressed against the rear wall. There was nowhere to go. Jonah was forced to step closer to her to avoid the biting wind. The space was so tight that his body walked her in. She could feel the heat radiating from him, smelling of sweat, leather, and the ozone scent of the storm. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough. He looked down at her. His face was inches from hers, coated in a fine layer of dust that made his blue eyes startle in their intensity. "I'm frightened," Elise admitted, her voice barely a whisper, though in the small echo chamber of the rocks, he heard it. "I have you," Jonah said. It was not a boast. It was a statement of fact. The wind howled, and a sudden gust forced Jonah to brace his hands on the rock wall on either side of her head to steady himself. His body pressed fully against hers. Elise gasped. For a woman who had lived a life of separate bedrooms and polite distances, the contact was overwhelming. She could feel the hard muscles of his chest against her softness, the heavy rhythm of his heart beating in time with hers. She looked up at him. The darkness of the cave made the moment intimate, suspended in time. He was not a wealthy investor now. He was just a man, shielding her from the elements. And she was not a widow. She was a woman, alive and trembling, not with fear, but with a sudden, sharp awareness of him. Jonah looked at her mouth. He saw the pulse fluttering in her throat. He wanted to lean in. The desire hit him with the force of the storm outside, raw and undeniable. He realized then that he had been on the wrong train. Yes, but he would have wrecked a dozen trains to be standing exactly where he was right now. But he did not move. He held his position, a guardian statue, until the wind began to die down hours later. Night fell over the desert, clear and cold. The storm had scrubbed the sky clean, leaving a canopy of stars so bright they looked like spilled diamonds. They made a small camp in the shelter of the rocks. Chayton sat slightly apart, sharpening his knife, his eyes scanning the darkness. Jonah built a small fire from dried mesquite roots. Elise sat near the flames, wrapping her shawl tighter. The adrenaline of the storm had faded, leaving a hollow ache in her chest. "You handled the horse well," Jonah said, breaking the silence. He handed her a tin cup of coffee. "I learned to ride in a park in Boston," Elise said with a dry laugh. "On a groomed path, wearing a velvet habit. I never imagined riding for my life." "You are far from Boston." "Elise," Jonah said softly. He used her given name. It sounded heavy on his tongue. "I was far from Boston even when I lived there," she confessed, looking into the fire. "Arthur, my husband. He was a good man, I suppose. He provided, he was respected. But he looked at me the way he looked at his pocket watch, something to be kept polished, functioning, and in its pocket." Jonah watched the firelight dance on her face. "My father was a coal miner in Pennsylvania," he said suddenly. He died coughing up black dust when I was 12. I swore I would never be like him. I clawed my way out of the pit. I laid track until my hands bled. I fought men for an extra $1. I thought if I built enough railroads, if I owned enough steel, I could build a wall between me and the dirt. He looked at his hands, now stained with the dust of the Nevada desert. But out here, the money does not matter. The walls do not hold. No, Elise said, reaching out to touch his hand. They do not, but perhaps that is good. Perhaps we were suffocating behind those walls. Their fingers interlaced. It was a tentative touch, bridging the gap between their two worlds. Sleep, Chayton said from the darkness, his voice cutting through the moment. We ride at first light. The jackals are close. The next day brought violence. They were tracking the bandits' trail through a dry riverbed when a shot rang out, echoing off the canyon walls. Ambush! Chayton yelled. He threw himself from his horse, rolling behind a boulder and returning fire with his rifle in one fluid motion. Jonah reacted instantly, pulling his revolver and spurring his horse to put himself between the shooter and Elise. Get down! Jonah shouted. A bullet whizzed past, too close. Elise felt a sharp, searing pain in her upper left arm. She cried out, clutching her shoulder, and nearly slipped from the saddle. Elise! Jonah screamed. He fired 3 shots in rapid succession toward the ridge where the smoke had puffed. He saw a man fall. The remaining ambushers, realizing they had lost the element of surprise against a superior marksman like Chayton, broke and ran. Jonah was off his horse before it stopped moving. He ran to Elise, pulling her down gently. Let me see, he demanded, his voice tight with panic. It burns, she gasped, her face pale. They moved to the shade of a cottonwood tree near the riverbank. Chayton kept watch, his back to them, giving them privacy. I need to see the wound, Jonah said. His hands, usually so steady, were trembling slightly. I have to cut the fabric. He took a knife and carefully slit the shoulder of her dress and the chemise beneath. The fabric fell away, revealing her pale skin and a jagged, angry furrow where the bullet had grazed her. It was bleeding freely, but it had not hit the bone. It is a graze, Jonah breathed, relief washing over him. It is deep, but it will heal. He took his canteen and a clean handkerchief. This will hurt. He poured the water over the wound. Elise hissed, biting her lip to keep from crying out. Jonah worked with surprising tenderness, cleaning the blood away. His fingers brushed against her collarbone, the curve of her neck. The danger had stripped away the last layers of propriety. Elise looked at him, focused entirely on his task. She saw the sweat on his brow, the line of worry between his eyes. She felt his hands on her bare skin, not as a doctor, but as a man. Jonah, she whispered. He looked up. His hand was resting on her uninjured shoulder, his thumb tracing the line of her throat. The distance between them seemed to vanish. The desert heat, the fear of death, the raw physical reality of her skin under his hand, it broke the dam. He leaned in. She did not pull away. She leaned toward him. Their lips met. It was not the polite, dry kiss of a society courtship. It was desperate. It tasted of salt and dust and coffee. Jonah kissed her as if he were drowning, and she was the only air left in the world. One of his hands tangled in her dark hair, tilting her head back. Elise made a small sound in her throat, her good arm wrapping around his neck, pulling him closer. For a minute, there was no Silas Morgan. No will, no railroad. There was only the heat of the sun and the heat of their bodies pressing together in the dust. Chayton cleared his throat loudly. They broke apart, breathless, foreheads resting against each other for a second. The wound is dressed, Jonah said, his voice hoarse. But we are not done. Chayton walked over, looking at them with an expression that was unreadable, yet knowing. The scout you killed, Chayton said to Jonah. He carried a map. Their camp is 2 miles upriver, in the Blind Box Canyon. He looked at Jonah, then at Elise. You touch her as if you own her. Chayton said quietly to Jonah, remember, White Wolf. A man who tries to own the wind ends up with empty hands. If your heart is true, good. If you are like your people who take and leave nothing, then leave her now." Jonah stood up, helping Elise to her feet. He looked Chayton in the eye. "I am not leaving her." The raid on the bandit camp was swift and brutal. They left the horses behind and moved on foot. The camp was located in a box canyon, a dead end. There were 5 men left, relaxing, thinking their scout was still on watch. Chayton moved like smoke. He took out the sentry with a stone, silent and efficient. Jonah and Elise crept toward the main tent where the saddlebags were piled. "Wait here," Jonah signaled to Elise behind a stack of crates. "No," she mouthed. "My papers." Jonah shook his head but didn't argue. He handed her his spare pistol, a small derringer he kept in his boot. "Do not use it unless they touch you." Jonah stepped into the clearing. "Gentlemen," he announced, his voice booming. The bandits scrambled for their guns, but Chayton dropped from the rocks above, knocking 2 heads together before they could stand. Jonah engaged the leader, a burly man with a scar. It was a fist fight, brutal and ugly. Jonah took a heavy blow to the jaw, but countered with a right hook that would have felled an ox. Elise saw her valise. It was sitting open on a crate. She ran to it. The papers were there. The deed, the will, and a leather-bound folio that belonged to the bandits. She grabbed the papers, clutching them to her chest. The fight was over as quickly as it had begun. Chayton and Jonah had the remaining bandits tied up within minutes. "Let us go before more come," Jonah said, wiping blood from his split lip. He looked at Elise, grinning like a boy who had won a prize fight. "We got them," but Elise was not smiling. She was staring at a document she had pulled from the folio, a contract she had found mixed in with her husband's papers. It was dated 3 years ago. "Elise," Jonah asked, his smile fading. "What is it?" She held up the paper. Her hands were shaking so hard the paper rattled. "This is the original survey agreement for the railway line through the valley," she said, her voice hollow. "Between the Morgan Consortium and the surveyors." "I know," Jonah said, stepping closer. "I told you. Silas planned this." "It is signed by 3 people," Elise said. She looked at him, her eyes filling with tears of betrayal. "Arthur Ward, Silas Morgan, and you." Jonah froze. "Jonah Hale." Elise read the signature. It was bold, arrogant. "You authorized the survey. You authorized the blasting crews to test the rock 3 years ago." "Elise, listen." Jonah stepped forward, reaching for her. "I signed hundreds of contracts. I was in Chicago. I never saw the land. I just saw the grade reports. I did not know it was a burial ground. I did not know it was this land." "You financed it!" Elise screamed. The sound echoed off the canyon walls. "You paid for the dynamite that they are going to use to blow up Chayton's ancestors." "You paid for the men who killed my husband?" "No. Arthur died of a heart attack. But you were his partner. You were part of the machine that sent me here." She backed away from him, clutching the papers as if they were a shield. They were standing on the edge of the canyon rim, overlooking the rushing river below. "I am not that man anymore," Jonah pleaded. "I was blind. I just saw profit. But I see you now. I see the land now." "Do you?" Elise cried. "Or are you just managing your investment, ensuring the widow does not cause a scene so you can smooth things over with Silas later?" "Elise, no!" She took another step back. Her boot heel found the edge of the loose shale. The ground beneath her gave way. Elise gasped as her footing vanished. She scrambled for purchase, but the gravel poured over the edge like water. She fell backward, sliding toward the 50-foot drop to the river. "Jonah!" Jonah did not think. He did not calculate. He lunged. He threw himself flat on the treacherous ground, his hands shooting out. He caught her wrist just as she went over the edge. The jolt nearly pulled him over with her. He slammed his shoulder into the rock to anchor them, gritting his teeth against the agony. Elise dangled over the abyss, the river roaring below. Her only link to the world, the hand of the man she had just accused of ruining her life. She looked up at him, eyes wide with terror. "Let me go," she sobbed, swinging in the wind. "I am just a burden. Let me go." Jonah looked down at her. His face was streaked with dust and blood, but his eyes were fierce, burning with a terrifying intensity. He tightened his grip until his knuckles turned white. "No!" he growled. The wind whipped his hair around his face. "I let too much slip away already. I let my honor go. I let my soul go for a stack of money, but I am not letting you go." He pulled. He groaned with the effort, his muscles straining, dragging her inch by inch back up the cliff face. He hauled her over the rim and collapsed backward, pulling her on top of him, away from the edge. They lay there in the dirt, chests heaving, hearts hammering against each other. Elise buried her face in his neck, sobbing. Jonah wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her hair, holding her so tight that he thought he might crush her. He had met the wrong train. He had signed the wrong papers. But holding her now, he knew with absolute certainty that he would burn the entire railroad to the ground before he let her fall. The valley known as Silver Creek to the surveyors, and the sleeping giant's breath to the indigenous people, lay before them like an open wound in the earth, beautiful and terrifying. Red sandstone cliffs rose hundreds of feet on either side, carved by wind and time into shapes that resembled cathedral spires and silent watchers. The river cut through the center, a ribbon of turquoise that seemed impossibly bright against the dusty ochre of the ground. Elise Ward pulled her horse to a stop at the ridge. Beside her, Chayton sat motionless, his expression unreadable, though his hand rested heavily on the neck of his mount. Jonah Hale brought up the rear, his face grim under the shadow of his hat. Down in the basin, the reality of the conflict was etched into the landscape. On the near side, near the river, stood the encampment of Chayton's people, tippies made of buffalo hide, smoke rising and thin, lazy columns, children playing near the water's edge. It was a scene of fragile peace. On the far side, however, the scar of progress had already begun. A temporary rail line, jagged and ugly, had been laid across the scrubland, ending abruptly near a pile of timber and steel rails. Tents of white canvas were clustered there, marked with the insignia of the Morgan Mining Consortium. Men moved like ants, dragging equipment, drilling into the rock face. "There," Chayton said, pointing to a cluster of ancient stones near the cliff base, dangerously close to where the drilling crew was setting charges. "The ancestors sleep there, and there is where he wants to lay the iron road." Elise looked. She saw the wooden markers, the scraps of dyed cloth fluttering in the breeze. It was not empty land. It was a cemetery, and she held the deed to it. "We are not too late," Jonah said, though his voice lacked conviction. He pointed to the north, "But we are not alone." A cloud of dust was approaching from the direction of the dustfall. It was a large party riders, wagons, and a carriage. The glint of sunlight on metal betrayed the presence of rifles. "Silas," Elise whispered. "He brought an army," Jonah observed, checking the load in his revolver. "And witnesses." As the cavalcade drew closer to the valley floor, Elise recognized the figures. Silas Morgan rode in the carriage, looking like a king surveying his conquest. Flanking him were a dozen armed men mercenaries, by the look of them, hard-faced and heavily armed. But behind them rode Sheriff Cole, looking uncomfortable on a roan mare, and a procession of townspeople from Dustfall, including Nora from the saloon. He wants a show, Jonah realized. He wants to legitimize the theft in front of the town. If he takes the land by force with the sheriff watching, it becomes law. "Then we give him a show," Elise said, her fear transmuting into a cold, hard resolve. She kicked her horse forward, descending the slope toward the confrontation. The two groups met in the center of the clearing, 100 yards from the river. The air was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the stamping of horses and the distant rush of the water. Silas Morgan stepped down from his carriage. He was dressed in a pristine gray suit, brushing an imaginary speck of dust from his lapel. He looked at Elise, then at Jonah, and finally at Chayton, his lip curling in distaste. "Mrs. Ward," Silas said, his voice booming to carry to the gathered crowd. "I must say, I am surprised to see you alive. The desert is a dangerous place for a woman alone." "I was not alone," Elise said, her voice steady. She dismounted, standing tall despite her torn, dusty clothes. And the danger did not come from the desert, Mr. Morgan. It came from the men you paid to attack my train. A murmur rippled through the crowd of townspeople. Sheriff Cole shifted in his saddle, looking at the ground. Preposterous accusations. Silas waved a hand dismissively. I am here to enforce the terms of your late husband's will. The 6 months are up at noon today. You failed to file your claim at the office in Dustfall. Therefore, the land reverts to the consortium. The deadline is noon, Elise said, pulling the pocket watch Jonah had lent her. It is currently 11 o'clock. And since you are the head of the consortium and the sheriff is here as a witness, I am filing my claim right now. She reached into her saddlebag and pulled out the leather valise, the one she and Jonah had retrieved from the bandit camp. She held it up high. Here is the deed, Elise declared. And here is the will, retrieved from the thieves you hired to steal them. Silas's eyes narrowed. For a second, the mask of the benevolent businessman slipped, revealing the shark beneath. That valise was lost in a robbery. If you have it, you likely stole it yourself. Those papers are forgeries. They are not forgeries. Jonah stepped forward, placing himself beside Elise. I have reviewed them. They are the originals. Silas looked at Jonah with a mixture of pity and menace. Jonah, my disappointed partner, you choose to stand with this hysterical woman and these savages against your own interests, against the future. I stand with the truth, Jonah said. The truth, Silas laughed, a harsh, barking sound. He turned to the townspeople. The truth is that this valley sits on a fortune of silver, a fortune that will build schools in Dustfall, pave your streets, and put food on your tables. But this woman, he pointed a gloved finger at Elise, and her pet Indian want to keep it a wasteland. They want to honor piles of old rocks while your children go hungry. It was a calculated move. The townspeople looked at one another. Greed and need were powerful motivators. We have a contract, Silas shouted, pulling a document from his coat. Signed 3 years ago by Arthur Ward, by myself, and by Mr. Jonah Hale. He brandished the paper Jonah had signed. Mr. Hale authorized the blasting. He authorized the rail line. He is a hypocrite who has lost his nerve. Jonah felt the eyes of the crowd on him. He saw Elise look at him, not with accusation, but with support. She nodded slightly. Jonah took a deep breath. He is right, Jonah shouted, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. I signed it, the crowd gasped. I signed it because I was blind, Jonah continued, walking toward the crowd, his hands raised. I sat in an office in Chicago and looked at numbers. I did not see the people. I did not see the graves. I was a part of this machine. I helped build the engine that is trying to crush this valley. He stopped and looked directly at Sheriff Cole. But I am withdrawing my capital. As of this moment, the Morgan Consortium has lost its primary financier, and I am prepared to testify in a federal court that Silas Morgan orchestrated the robbery of the Overland No. 4 to prevent a legal heir from claiming her property. I saw his men, I fought them, and I recovered their orders. Lies, Silas screamed, his face turning red. Sheriff, arrest them. They are trespassing on company land. Sheriff Cole looked at Silas, then at Jonah. He looked at the armed mercenaries Silas had brought, and then at the indigenous warriors who had quietly emerged from the riverbank, bows drawn, flanking Chayton. Mr. Morgan, Cole said slowly, if Mrs. Ward has the deed, and it is not noon yet, this ain't company land. It is hers. Silas froze. The legal ground was crumbling beneath him. He looked at the sun, high in the sky. He looked at the stubborn set of Elise's jaw. He realized he could not win with paper. Fine, Silas snarled. He signaled to the leader of his mercenaries, a man with a scar across his nose. Blow it! No! Elise screamed. The mercenary leader raised a signal flag. On the cliffside, where the drilling crews had been working, a man lit a fuse. He is blowing the cliff face, Chayton shouted. To cover the graves. Stop them, Jonah roared, drawing his revolver. The scene exploded into chaos. The mercenaries opened fire, not to kill, but to suppress Chayton's warriors. The indigenous archers returned fire. The townspeople screamed and scattered, diving behind wagons for cover. A massive boom shook the earth. A cloud of dust and rock erupted from the cliffside. Boulders the size of carriages detached from the wall and crashed down, obliterating the ancient markers and blocking the river. The ground trembled violently, knocking Elise to her knees. But Silas was not just destroying the graves. He was creating a diversion. "The train!" a railway worker shouted, pointing down the temporary track. In the distance, black smoke billowed. A supply train, loaded with heavy timber and steel rails for the construction, was chugging toward the valley on the temporary spur line. It was intended to deliver materials for the bridge crossing. But the explosion had destabilized the temporary trestle bridge that spanned the river gorge just 100 yards ahead. One of the support beams had been sheared off by a falling boulder. The bridge was sagging dangerously. If the train crossed it, the weight would collapse the structure, sending the engine and the crew into the rocky depths below. "They cannot see the damage," Jonah yelled, squinting through the dust. "The curve hides the bridge." "There are men on that train," Elise said, horrified. "Engineers, workers. They will die," Chayton said, knocking an arrow. "Silas sacrifices his own—" Silas was climbing back into his carriage, preparing to flee in the confusion. "Let it fall," he shouted to his men. "Let the accident happen. We will blame the savages." Elise looked at the train, then at the bridge. She looked at the red flag that had been dropped by one of the fleeing surveyors near the tracks. She did not think. She ran. "Elise!" Jonah shouted. She scrambled up the embankment toward the railway line. The train was half a mile away, picking up speed for the grade. The whistle blew, a cheerful, oblivious sound. "Cover her," Jonah ordered Chayton. Jonah raised his revolver and fired at a mercenary who was aiming his rifle at the running woman. The mercenary dropped. Chayton and his warriors advanced, engaging Silas's men in fierce hand-to-hand combat to keep them away from the tracks. Elise reached the railbed. Her lungs were burning. The ground was uneven, strewn with gravel. She grabbed the red flag, the wooden handle rough in her palm. She stood in the center of the tracks. The train was a black monster growing larger by the second. The ground vibrated under her boots. Chug, 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 chug. She waved the flag frantically. "Stop, stop," she screamed, though she knew they could not hear her over the roar of the engine. The engineer was looking down at his gauges. He did not see the small figure in the dust. "He does not see her," Jonah cried. He broke cover, sprinting after her. He had to get to her before the train did. Bullets kicked up dirt around his heels. He ignored them. He ran with the desperation of a man who saw his entire world standing in the path of a locomotive. On the train, the fireman looked up. He squinted. "Hey, there is someone on the track." The engineer looked up. His eyes widened. He slammed the brake lever forward and threw the reverse gear. Sparks flew from the wheels. The screech of metal on metal was deafening, a high-pitched shriek that tore through the valley. But a train loaded with steel does not stop instantly. It slid, momentum carrying it forward, eating up the distance. Elise stood her ground. She could smell the burning oil. She could feel the heat of the boiler. She kept waving the flag, tears streaming down her face, dust choking her. "I will not move. I will not let them die." "Elise, jump!" Jonah's voice cut through the noise. He was there. He lunged onto the tracks, tackling her around the waist. They hit the gravel hard, rolling down the embankment just as the cowcatcher of the engine passed the spot where she had been standing. The train groaned, shuddered, and finally ground to a halt, the front wheels mere feet from the unstable bridge. The structure groaned under the weight of the stopped engine, but held. Elise and Jonah tumbled to the bottom of the slope, coming to rest in a tangle of limbs. They were covered in soot, dirt, and scratches. Jonah was on top of her, his body shielding hers. He was breathing hard, great gasping breaths that shook his frame. He lifted his head and looked down at her. His eyes were wild, terrified, and incredibly alive. "You fool," he rasped, his voice breaking. "You beautiful, stubborn fool." Elise reached up and touched his face. smearing dirt across his cheek. "I stopped it," she whispered. "I stopped the machine." "You did," Jonah said. He buried his face in her neck, holding her so tightly it hurt. "I thought I lost you. I swore I would never let you go, and I almost lost you." "You caught me," Elise said. "You were on the right train this time." Above them, the silence returned to the valley, heavier than before. The train hissed steam. The shooting had stopped. Sheriff Cole rode into the center of the chaos, his gun finally drawn. He pointed it directly at Silas Morgan, who was trying to whip his horses into a run. "That is enough, Mr. Morgan," Cole shouted, his voice steady for the first time in years. "Get down from there. You cannot arrest me," Silas spat. "I own this town. You attempted to cause a mass casualty event," Cole said, "and I have a witness here." He pointed to one of the captured mercenaries who was being held at knife point by Nora, who is very eager to talk about who paid for the robbery of the Overland Number 4 to save his own neck. The mercenary nodded vigorously. "It was him. He paid us $500 each." The townspeople, seeing the near disaster with the train and the destruction of the cliff, had turned. They surrounded Silas's carriage, their faces angry. They realized that Silas would have killed their husbands and sons on that train just to make a point. Silas Morgan looked around. He saw the hostility. He saw Jonah and Elise standing up, dusty but unbroken. He saw Chayton watching him with arms crossed. He dropped the reins. It was over. Chayton walked over to the cliff face. The explosion had scarred the rock, burying the ancient markers under tons of rubble. He touched the stone, his face filled with grief. Elise walked up to him. "I'm so sorry, Chayton. We tried." Chayton looked at her. "The stones are broken," he said softly. "But the bones beneath are still there, and the people are still here. You stopped the Iron Snake. That is what matters." He looked at the train, halted inches from the abyss. "You have a warrior's heart." Elise Ward. Jonah joined them, limping slightly. He put his arm around Elise's waist, pulling her close. She leaned into him, her strength finally failing her now that the danger was past. "What happens now?" Jonah asked, looking at the ruined bridge and the stalled train. "Now," Elise said, looking at the deed she still clutched in her hand. "We rebuild, but we do it our way." She looked up at Jonah. "We have a station to build, and a new route to survey. One that goes around the mountain, not through it." Jonah smiled, a tired, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "It will cost a fortune to reroute." "Then it is a good thing I have a wealthy partner," Elise teased weakly. "Former wealthy partner," Jonah corrected. "I imagine my stocks in Chicago are plummeting as we speak." "Then we will be poor together," Elise said. Jonah kissed her forehead. "I can live with that." The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the valley. The red rocks turned to purple. The scar of the explosion was ugly, but the valley was still standing. The silence was not the silence of death, but the silence of a pause before a new chapter. Elise looked at the train, then at the townspeople leading Silas away in irons, and finally at Chayton and his people returning to their teepees. She had come west to fulfill a dead man's will. She had found a life she never expected, and standing in the circle of Jonah's arms, she knew she was finally home. The dust from the explosion took hours to fully settle, hanging in the air like a golden mist that turned the setting sun into a bloody smear against the western sky. The roar of the dynamite and the screech of the train wheels had been replaced by a silence so profound it made the ears ring. It was not the peaceful silence of the desert dawn, but the heavy, exhausted silence of a battlefield where the living were still counting the cost of their survival. On the bank of the river, away from the ruined bridge and the cooling locomotive, a makeshift triage had been established. The town doctor, a man named Dr. Aris who had ridden out with the posse, was tending to the more serious injuries among the mercenaries and the townspeople. But near the water's edge, in the neutral ground between the indigenous encampment and the rail line, Elise Ward was tending to Jonah Hale. Jonah sat on a flat rock, his shirt stripped off to his waist, His body was a map of the last few days, bruises blooming dark purple against his ribs, a long, shallow cut across his forearm from the gravel slide, and the older scars of his laboring youth. Elise knelt before him, dipping a cloth into a basin of river water that Chayton had brought them. "This will sting," Elise said softly, wringing out the cloth. "I believe I have lost the right to complain about a little stinging," Jonah replied, though he hissed sharply through his teeth as she pressed the cool, wet fabric against the scrape on his shoulder. Elise did not pull away. She worked with a steady, rhythmic precision. Her own hands were scraped, her fingernails broken and rimmed with dirt, but her touch was gentle. "You stopped the train," she said, her eyes focused on the wound. "You ran into the line of fire. I saw you on the tracks," Jonah said, looking down at the top of her head. "The logic of the businessman vanished. I just saw you." Elise looked up, her hands pausing on his skin. The connection between them was raw, stripped of all the social pretenses of Boston or Chicago. They were two survivors, battered and dirty, sitting in the dirt. "And now?" she asked. "The logic returns." Jonah looked over her shoulder at the captured Silas Morgan, who was being shackled to the wheel of a wagon by Sheriff Cole. "No," Jonah said. "The logic has changed. I look at that train, and I see a monster. I look at this valley, and I see—" He trailed off, his gaze drifting to where Chayton was standing with the elders of his tribe, surveying the damage to the cliff face. "I see something worth more than silver." Elise finished tying the bandage. She rested her hand flat against his chest for a moment, feeling the steady, strong beat of his heart. "Good," she whispered, "because we have a mess to clean up." The meeting took place an hour later. As twilight began to bleed into the valley, it was not a formal council. There were no tables, no gavels, no stenographers. It was a circle of people standing in the dust, illuminated by the flickering light of campfires and the lanterns from the train. Sheriff Cole stood in the center, looking more tired than Elise had ever seen a man look. Around him gathered a strange assembly, the rough-handed miners and shopkeepers from Dustfall, the stoic warriors and women of Chayton's tribe, the railway engineers who looked sheepish and confused, and in the middle of it all, Elise and Jonah. "All right," Cole said, his voice rasping. "We need to settle this before the sun is fully down. I have got Silas Morgan and his lead men in custody. They will be transported to the federal marshal in Carson City tomorrow on charges of attempted murder, sabotage, and grand larceny." A murmur of approval went through the townspeople. They had feared Silas, but seeing him try to kill their own kin on that train had broken his hold on them. "However," Cole continued, turning to Elise, "that leaves the matter of the land, and the silver, and the jobs." He looked at the miners. "These boys came here for work. Mrs. Ward. Silas promised them wages. If the mine shuts down, Dustfall dies. That is the hard truth." Then he looked at Chayton. "And this man says this is holy ground. And I reckon, after seeing those rocks come down, he is right." All eyes turned to Elise. She held the leather valise. Inside it were the papers that gave her absolute legal power over everyone standing in that circle. She could evict the tribe. She could fire the miners. She could sell it all to a new investor. Elise stepped forward. She felt the weight of the silence. She looked at the deed in her hand, then at the destruction on the cliff face. She thought of Arthur, signing papers in his mahogany office, moving mountains he had never seen. "This deed," Elise began, her voice clear and carrying in the still air, "says that I own the Silver Creek claim. It says I own the water, the rock, and the sky above it." She paused. She walked over to Chayton. The warrior watched her, his face impassive, but his muscles coiled tight. "But paper does not tell the truth," Elise said. "I cannot own the bones of other people's ancestors. I cannot own a cathedral just because I bought the land it sits on." She turned back to the crowd. "I am filing the claim, but I am not keeping the valley." A gasp went through the miners. "You are shutting us down," one man shouted angrily. "No," Elise said firmly. "I am redefining the terms." She looked at Jonah, seeking his support. He nodded, a silent anchor. "I propose a partition," Elise announced. "I will legally transfer the title of the canyon floor, the river, and the burial cliffs back to the tribe. It will be recognized as their sovereign territory, protected by federal deed, which I will enforce." She turned to the miners. "However, the plateau to the east, the flat scrubland where the train is currently sitting, that remains mine, and I intend to build a station there." "A station?" Nora spoke up from the crowd, arms crossed over her chest. "For a train that goes nowhere." "For a train that goes around," Elise corrected. "Mister, Hale and I have discussed it. The rail line can be rerouted along the southern rim. It adds 10 miles of track. Yes, it is expensive, yes, but it leaves the valley intact." "And the silver?" a miner asked. "The silver deep in the canyon stays in the earth," Elise said, her voice hard. "But there are veins on the plateau. We will open a cooperative mine on the rim, small scale, safe, and the profits will be split 3 ways. 40% to the investors to pay for the infrastructure, 30% to the workers, and 30% to the tribe, as a lease payment for the right to transport ore through their ancestral buffer zones." Silence descended again as the math was done in 100 heads. 30% to the Indians, a man grumbled. "Silas would have kept it all. Silas is in chains." Jonah's voice cut through the dark. He stepped up beside Elise. "Silas tried to kill you to save a percentage point. Mrs. Ward is offering you a living wage, a safe job, and a town that is not run by a tyrant." "Take the deal." Chayton stepped forward. He looked at Elise, searching her face for any sign of deception. He saw only exhaustion and a fierce, stubborn hope. "You give the bones back?" Chayton asked. "I give them back," Elise said. "Legally, forever." Chayton looked at his people. The elders nodded slowly. It was not a perfect victory. The white men would still be near. The iron horse would still rumble on the rim, but it was survival. It was recognition. "We accept," Chayton said. "But," he raised a hand, his eyes locking onto Jonah, "the iron horse stays on the rim. If one rail crosses the shadow line of the canyon floor, the truce is broken. I will survey the line myself," Jonah promised. "It will not cross." Sheriff Cole let out a long, explosive breath. "Well," he said, rubbing his face, "that sounds like a plan. I will need a lot of paperwork to make this legal." "We have time," Elise said, finally smiling. "I am not going anywhere." Later that night, the camp had settled into a rhythm of recovery. The miners had retreated to their tents, grumbling but hopeful. The tribe had returned to their fires. Elise and Jonah stood by the river, washing the last of the soot from their faces. The water was cold and clean, a balm to their stinging skin. "You gave away a fortune today," Jonah said quietly. "That valley floor, the geological surveys said the richest vein was right under the burial ground." "I know," Elise said. She dried her face with her sleeve. "Does it bother you?" Jonah picked up a stone and skipped it across the water. 3 days ago, it would have killed me. I would have been calculating the loss in my head. He turned to her. "But 3 days ago, I was a man who thought he could buy his way out of his own history. And now I am a man with no suit, a ruined reputation in Chicago, and a minority partner in a rimside mine." Jonah chuckled. It was a light, free sound. "Silas will slander me in every boardroom from Boston to St. Louis. I will never raise capital in the East again." "Does that frighten you?" Elise asked, moving closer to him. "Terrifies me," Jonah admitted. "I have to start over, from the dirt up." "You are not starting from scratch," Elise said. She reached out and took his hand. "You have the expertise. You have the station rights. And you have a partner who is very stubborn." Jonah looked at her hand in his. "A partner," he repeated. "Is that what we are?" "For business, yes," Elise said. Her heart hammered against her ribs. "For the rest, we will see." Jonah pulled her gently toward him. "I can work with that." Elise leaned her head against his chest. She looked up at the stars, framed by the canyon walls. "Arthur's will," she murmured. It said I had to come here alone. It said I had to be self-sufficient. He thought he was punishing me. He thought he was sending me to a place that would break me, so I would run back to the safety of his memory. He did not know you, Jonah said. Not really. No? Elise agreed. He knew the girl I was. He did not know the woman I could become. She squeezed Jonah's hand. I came here because of a dead man's will, but I am staying because of my own will, my choice, my land, my life. The difference was subtle, but it shifted the entire axis of her world. She was no longer a passenger on Arthur's train. She was an engineer of her own. The next morning brought a scene of quiet industry that was more moving to Elise than any grand ceremony. The sun was bright and hard, revealing the full extent of the damage to the cliff. The explosion had brought down tons of rock, burying the wooden markers and totem poles that had stood sentinel over the graves. Elise was down by the rock slide early, wearing work gloves she had borrowed from a miner. She was dragging smaller stones away, clearing a path. She was not alone for long. Nora came down from the camp, bringing a pot of coffee and a shovel. Then came the women of the tribe. They did not speak to the white women at first. They worked side by side, moving the debris. One of the older indigenous women, the one who had been watching Elise closely during the meeting, stopped and pointed to a large, carved cedar pole that had been knocked over and half buried in shale. It was heavy, too heavy for one person to lift. Elise went to it. She grabbed the base. Nora grabbed the middle. The indigenous woman grabbed the top. Together, straining, their boots slipping in the gravel, they heaved. 1, 2, 3, Nora grunted. The pole rose. It wavered, then slid into its post hole with a heavy thud. They packed rocks around the base to steady it. The indigenous woman wiped sweat from her forehead. She looked at Elise. She did not smile, but she reached into her pouch and pulled out a handful of seeds, blue corn. She pressed them into Elise's dirty palm. For the new planting, the woman said in broken English. Where the fire burned, the corn grew tall. Elise looked at the seeds. They were small, hard, and full of potential. Thank you, she whispered. Chayton approached them then. He was carrying his bow, watching the perimeter where the miners were dismantling the drilling equipment to move it to the plateau. You work like a mule, Chayton observed, looking at Elise's dusty face. I am protecting my investment, Elise retorted, though her smile took the sting out of the words. Chayton nodded toward the plateau. The white wolf. Jonah. He's up there, marking the line. I know. He has kept his word so far, Chayton said. He moved the stakes back 50 paces from the edge. He learned, Elise said. Perhaps, Chayton said. His face grew serious. But you must know this. Elise Ward, the Iron Horse is hungry. It always wants more. Today, we have peace. But tomorrow, or next year, or in 10 years, more men like Silas will come. They will look at this valley and see only money. He leaned on his bow. I fight with you today because you have honor. But if the day comes when you or your children forget this agreement, if the rails creep down the wall, I will not be your friend. I will be the stone that breaks the wheel. Elise met his gaze. It was a warning, stark and real. There was no happily ever after in the West, only a series of negotiated truces. I understand, Elise said solemnly. If that day comes, Chayton, you have my permission to break the wheel. But I intend to raise children who know the difference between a rock and a grave. Chayton studied her for a long moment. Then he gave a single, sharp nod. Good. He turned to walk away, then stopped. The name of this valley, he said. In your tongue, Silver Creek. It is a weak name. What should it be? Elise asked. The place where the iron bent, Chayton said. He walked back toward the river, leaving Elise standing amidst the recovering land. Up on the ridge, she could see Jonah's silhouette against the blue sky. He was holding a surveyor's transit, measuring the earth. He paused and waved to her a small, dark figure against the vastness. Elise waved back. She put the blue corn seeds in her pocket, right next to the folded deed. She picked up her shovel. There was still a lot of rock to move, and the sun was climbing high, but for the first time since she had boarded the train in Boston, she did not feel the weight of the past pressing down on her. She felt only the heat of the sun and the promise of the seeds in her pocket. She was tired. She was sore. She was arguably poorer than she had been yesterday, but she was free.